somebody pointed out, this is another one of those things that I appreciate. Somebody pointed out in the comments section that when we use these passages to talk about the authentic self, now that it is no longer I that do it, okay, we on this channel are using the word ego to refer to the carnality and flesh and the false self and the culturally constructed self. Somebody pointed out that the Bible uses the word ego in reference to when we are addressing what we would consider the authentic self. Okay? So what I'd ask you to do is do not do a one-for-one semantic proposition matching. And just because we say ego over here and use it this way, that means that someone who uses ego, the word ego in Romans 7:17, is talking about exactly the same thing we are. Remember, context is everything. Okay? So since somebody pointed that out, I do think it's worth mentioning. When we say ego here on this channel, we're not talking about the Greek word ego, which can sometimes refer to the authentic self. We're talking about the false self, the inauthentic self, the cocoon self, the culturally constructed self, all right, that we've been over many times on this channel, okay? Brother Dave says, I think you should offer such services. Sure, it would help many folks. So I'm thinking about doing that. So when we say ego, we're not talking about conceit and arrogance. In yesterday's live stream, Cecil Spurlock Jr. asked this question, speaking of egos, do you agree with Seraphim? As he says, BTF listeners don't have the mentality to understand or grasp what he and you are trying to expose them to, except for a few. Now, we answered that yesterday, so I'm not gonna answer it here. But then he clarified by saying, I was referring to the ego that has evolved into arrogance, brother. And so when we say ego, we're not talking about arrogance and conceit. We're talking about the culturally constructed self, the version of you that interacts with everything around you, that you tend to think of as your identity. The less you have transcended the ego, the more you think of those things as your identity. Cecil also asked this question, Kevin, brother, let's make it, I think he meant to say, I think there's some typos here. Let's make it completely clear for all who may hear. Do you believe God has ever given an immoral command as Calvinists do? So I answered that down here quickly off the top of my head. I don't have great clock speed to come up with the best answers. That's one of the reasons I don't think I would do good in a debate. I can think more clearly if you give me a few minutes, give me some time, maybe a day or two. And I prefer that. I prefer thinking about things to come up with good answers and not trying to have gotcha moments or anything like that. Initially, I said I'm not aware of any immoral commands, but at the same time, I would imagine that morality is a spectrum depending on perspective and that perhaps it's not a problem-free metric. Okay? What one person calls moral, morality might not be the correct metric to apply. There are places like in 2 Chronicles 18, Ezekiel 14, I believe, I, the Lord, have deceived that prophet and will send forth this spirit to be a lying spirit in the mouth of all the prophets of Ahab. Now that kind of stuff happened. But let's go back to the heart of the question though. He says, do you believe God has ever given an immoral command as Calvinists do? So the reason somebody would ask that question is because they're trying to have some kind of dividing line litmus test, like the Pharisees did with Jesus. See, if Jesus stoned the woman, he would be in trouble with the Romans, and you could turn him, because they weren't allowed to execute capital punishment. You could turn him over to the Romans, and then he would be in prison with them for instigating a stoning, which the Jews weren't allowed to do under Roman law. If Jesus doesn't stone the woman taken in adultery, then he's elevating Roman law over God's Jewish law from the Old Testament. So either way, it's catch-22, darned if you do, darned if you don't. That's the idea. And this is the kind of question. That's the same kind of thing these kind of questions are trying to do. And the right answer is when when I interface with Scripture, I'm not like this. I'm not doing it for the sake of being able to walk away with beliefs. See? That's not what I'm doing it for. I'm interfacing with Scripture to walk away with something to contemplate that will transform me more into the image of Christ. That's why I interface with Scripture. I'm not doing it. I don't have a product like this, okay? I'm walking away with beliefs. I either need to have a belief that God gave immoral commands, or that God did not give immoral commands. I don't need to have beliefs, see? I believe on Jesus Christ, but I don't need to have a list of beliefs. I don't need to have a list of propositions, things that I do and don't believe. Whether God did or did not do that does not depend on whether I believe he did or did not do that. There is no requirement for me to believe that he did or did not do that. There's no list of beliefs that I am required to have in Scripture. Okay? It doesn't work that way. I'm not saying there aren't things that we shouldn't believe. Okay? But go back and see our video on belief is not what you think. And please watch that before talking to me about any sentence or question that contains the word believe or belief or faith.